Hello, I'm Dan Sweet, Director of Public Relations for HAI. Welcome to the HAI at Work webinar series. Today's topic is our advanced air mobility future, leading with vision. We'll get started in just about a minute. We'd like to give people a chance to get in the door and settle in to watch the video or watch the session. Okay, thank you again for joining us today. We know that you have a very busy schedule. We know that this webinar is a bit later today than we normally do, but we are grateful for the panelists that we have with us. Our title, Leading with Vision, we chose that for a reason. We have some of the top leaders in the industry right now that can talk about advanced air mobility and how it's going to be changing our industry. Today's panelists will include Jim Viola, the President and CEO of HAI. We have the Honorable Michael Huerta, who is a former administrator with the Federal Aviation Administration. Ed Boland, President and CEO of the National Business Aviation Association. Gary Geisen, President and CEO of Whisk Aero. And we have a special moderator today, founder of JTR Strategies, Jenny Rosenberg. And she is a former acting assistant secretary for aviation and international affairs with the U.S. Department of Transportation, and a former assistant administrator with the FAA. Our webinars are interactive. We would like you to ask questions if you have questions. Please use the question module that's at the bottom of your screen or on the side of your screen. I'm not sure on every computer where it is. Submit it through there. Please don't use the chat feature unless you want to chat with others. We try to allow the chat to go along independently, and we do make sure that we do get to as many of the questions as we possibly can. This webinar is being recorded. We will make the recording available on our YouTube channel and on our website. It would be available for you to share with others if you feel it's interesting. And with that, I'd like to introduce Jim Viola, the President and CEO of HAI.
Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate that. You know, as you went through the introductions there, it was, I don't know, I think the former FAA people are reading the non-FAA, so it's kind of interesting, some of the experience and where it's coming from today. I do invite our panelists now to turn on their cameras, and I want to introduce each of you. I'll start with my friend and former boss, the Honorable Michael Huerta. Michael served from 2013 to 2018 as the administrator of the FAA, where he oversaw administration, aviation regulations, and a $16 billion budget. Also, we have Ed Boland. He has been the CEO of the National Business Aircraft or Aviation Association, NBAA, since 2004, representing the interest and needs of a diverse business aviation community, just as like we're going to talk about today, in policy and regulation. During his career, he has served on 2 aviation councils and appointed by 2 standing presidents. Our third is Gary Geisen, President and CEO of a Whisk Aero and an AAM vehicle developer and a manufacturer. Gary has more than 30 years of experience delivering market leadership and rapid growth in autonomous vehicles, energy, IoT, and enterprise high technology sectors, which very much plays into what we're going to talk about today. And then, as Dan mentioned, and I appreciate Mike Hertzendorf's ability to get our special guest moderator today, Jenny Rosenberg, founder of JTR Strategies, an internationally recognized leader in transportation policy and strategic communications. And she has served as acting assistant secretary for aviation and internal affairs in the U.S. Department of Transportation and as an assistant administrator at the FAA. So Jenny, thank you very much for joining us. And at this time, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jim. It's such an honor to be here today with all of the panelists, including Michael Huerta, who is also my former boss. And Jim, you are my former colleague as well from the FAA. I'm going to jump in right away with a question for you, Jim, and then I'll invite the panelists as we go through the questions to add their thoughts before I move on to the next question. Jim, HAI is in a wonderful position right now to help bring the aviation community together and lead the evolution into advanced air mobility. Can you talk a little bit about that and why HAI is making a concerted effort to take a leadership position on AAM?
Oh, well, I think a lot of that comes into, the helicopter community, the rotorcraft community has operated in an environment in the airspace, dealing a lot with the FAA, and that the technologies and the vehicles of the future are going to need that type of experience. I mean, it's part of it actually reaching out to our members to educate them on the vehicles that are coming, because they're not actually paying attention to that sector. And so we think that we can help safely integrate into the environment that the AAM and the urban air mobility vehicles want to operate in. We think we have the weather at the experience with the weather at that altitudes. You talk about the old days of the people that used to deliver checks and had to operate in that different type of weather than the business jets or the big jets that get above all that weather. But being able to actually operate and be able to deliver from point A to point B in a congested airspace in the weather that occurs at 2,000, 3,000 feet. And then also, the missions that are out there, the air medical mission, the airborne law enforcement mission, some of the air charter, part 135, as you move from, Ed and I have talked, you got the airplanes might move, then the helicopters will move, and then these future vehicles will do that last leg. And so we're all working together. It's something that we need to work on together to benefit the industry as well. Number one, though, for society, the capability that brings to move humans around and being able to take advantage of this technology out there. So I think that's one of the things that the helicopter community needs to realize, that we can help with that movement.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned, Ed, and NBAA is also taking a leadership role in the integration of AAM and vehicle certification. Ed, would you talk a little bit about what NBAA is doing in the advanced air mobility space?
Well, there's a lot of enthusiasm in the business aviation community for advanced air mobility. It's very much looking forward, but it builds on decades of experience. Because when we think of business aviation, what we're really talking about is on-demand air mobility. That ability to get people where they need to be when they need to be there. And through the decades, our industry has done that with piston propulsion, turbine propulsion. We've done it with fixed wing, we've done it with rotor wing, we've done it with aluminum, we've done it with composites. And what we're seeing now is an opportunity to build on that, to go to electric propulsion, hybrid, maybe even hydrogen. We're talking about using distributed propulsion to get places, people where they need to be when they need to be there. And in order for that to work, obviously we need the vehicles themselves, but we need an infrastructure. And in our community, that means an air traffic infrastructure and a ground infrastructure. And so NBAA has been working with policymakers, opinion leaders, and the advanced air mobility community to understand what the requirements are, what the needs are, and how do we build the physical infrastructure, the human infrastructure, the air traffic infrastructure. And of course, all of that requires awareness and acceptance. And so we're excited about where we are. We're more excited about where we're going.
Thank you. Gary, your company is in a really interesting position right now. How are you looking at trade associations like HAI and NBAA to take a leadership role to really help move the industry forward while you're working on all of the things that your company needs to, from vehicle certification and then social acceptance and more, but trade associations in aviation have traditionally taken a tremendous role in helping move policy forward, move social acceptance forward.
Well, I think you answered the question. I mean, it's all of what you just said. Both NBAA and HAI are instrumental in what we're doing. I mean, we're fundamentally trying to change transportation with the whole eVTOL market, which is a mix of rotor and fixed, if you will, and to provide a form of transportation that can be an everyday form of transportation and make that affordable. And so to do that, you've got all sorts of different stakeholders from a policy perspective, national, state, local, setting standards to do this. As Ed just mentioned, there are other factors. There's infrastructure factors, how you integrate into the airspace, all sorts of different vendors that have to come together to make this system work. And it requires that we have the policy support to go do so, that we have the funding, as example, to build the infrastructure that we need, that we have the regulatory roadmap to certify these new vehicles in a timely fashion. And so all of these things come together, and we're happy to be involved with both NBAA and HAI to make these things happen, because we, even though there are competitors in the space and different vendors building different types of aircraft, we all need to come together, as a collective unit to go make this happen.
Great. Thank you for that. Michael, as the immediate past FAA administrator, you're listening to the comments from HAI and NBA and from WISC right now. How would you advise the industry to come together to advocate for policies, particularly in the upcoming FAA reauthorization, that are needed to advance AAM?
I think, Jenny, it's important to, look at where this new technology is emerging from and how it is integrating with a very mature and very vibrant aviation community. The aviation community has a very unique culture. It is an innovation culture. It's a culture that places a very heavy emphasis on safety. A lot of the companies that are in the AAM space come out of the tech industry, where there is a culture of very rapid development and very rapid deployment of new technology. And I'm not saying one's right, one's wrong, just that they're different. And I think the companies that will be successful will find ways to blend those cultures together so that you can get the benefits of tech companies, their ability to adapt quickly, but at the same time, they have an appreciation for the need to ensure a safe system. There is a lot that needs to be done, though. We are making new policy. We're making new standards. We are establishing a whole new way to think of air transportation, where it becomes a very everyday occurrence for shorter haul trips than you've had in the past. And yes, people need to focus on certifying aircraft to ensure that they're safe. We need to focus on adapting our air traffic system to ensure that everything can operate safely. Eventually, you have to land. And that raises questions of where do you put infrastructure? And then there are a host of questions around the appropriate roles, not only of the FAA, but also our partners at the state and local level. And so there is a huge agenda that we have to work collaboratively on. And I think that trade associations like HAI, like NBAA, and a host of others really need to work in a very collaborative way to identify what are the principal policy questions and how can the industry come together to address them.
Jenny, just following up on what Michael said, because I think it's so well stated that you have an aviation community and a tech community, and they have entirely different approaches. If we can put those together and pull the best from both of those forward, the opportunity to safely and rapidly change the way the world moves and redefines mobility, what a special opportunity that is. And I think what all of us are trying to do is make sure we understand, appreciate, and recognize those values and then work together, because this clearly is something that's going to be not just in the interest of the tech world or the aviation world, but society itself.
Yeah, I think if I can just pull on that a second too. At one point we had our vehicles, the airplanes and helicopters, and we were looking forward to the technology coming into the helicopters to provide us better capability. And right now we have the major shift of the technology being developed in another aviation type of vehicle. And that's all we're trying to do now is get into that vehicle with them and tell them that we've operated helicopters in, as Michael said, a very mature airspace, but I think we still have room for growth in the lower altitudes and the helicopter capability. I mean, from my FAA experience, dealing with helicopter issues in Alaska, then dealing with helicopter issues in Vegas, then dealing with helicopter issues in New York, and they're all different. And if we want this industry to succeed with the urban air mobility, we need to have a common language and a common infrastructure for that to happen.
Gary, any follow-up thoughts before we move to the next round of questions?
Well, I think the point is a good one, and everybody's structured a little bit differently. But if you take tech, and WISC is actually a joint venture between Larry Page, Google, that whole foundation, Silicon Valley Innovation, and then Boeing, aerospace leader. And so I think the point is exactly right, that you can't just go innovate and build prototypes and build cool things that fly. You've got to build things that are safe and that get certified. And so having that right blend where you're still moving fast so you can introduce new things, but yet you're doing that in a framework where you're doing all of the things, you're working closely with the FAA as a partner early on in your development to make sure that, when you get to the end, you get a certified aircraft, you can fly people safely, and therefore becomes a successful part of the market.
Great, thank you. I think the next question, just looking at the FAA reauthorization, that's really right around the corner for us. The drone community was a little bit disappointed with the last reauthorization that there was not really much in there for them. And as this community is looking to the next FAA reauthorization, what is going to be your priority, and how are you going to ensure that at least there are some measures in this bill that are going to help support the AAM move forward? And maybe Jim and Ed, you could start off in response to that.
Okay, yeah, I think one of the things we're talking about is the infrastructure, and I'll just zero in on the opposite, maybe end of Ed's, which is things other than airports. We're still having discussions on vertiports, heliports. What is the capability to go into them? So I think trying to expand the ability for having landing areas or transition points, as Ed and I had talked, where you transition from one mode to the next mode, what that's going to look like, and if there's money for research and for development of those areas.
And I think, Jenny, there's multiple ways to come at this, and we've got legislative, we've got regulatory, we've got federal, we've got local. So there are a lot of different things, but we know first and foremost, we're looking at the helicopter AC, recognizing that it does not prohibit the use of, explicitly prohibit advanced air mobility vehicles from operating at heliports. So we'll look forward to what those requirements are. We also have a vertiports AC that is going to be out there, an opportunity for our community to come together with performance requirements that are appropriate for this new form of mobility. So there are things to be done physically on that infrastructure in terms of what the requirements are. Then, of course, as we move into the legislation, we want to make sure that there's adequate opportunity and funding provided for both planning and construction. Planning takes a long time in the aviation world. You've got to come together and decide what you want to build, where you want to build it, how is it going to operate. We want to make sure that that planning is begun now, that there is money available, not just for the planning, but the construction as well. So as we're coming together today, it's very focused on what are the legislative requirements, the policy requirements, what is the awareness that is needed, what is the acceptance that's needed to move this forward. And all of these things are tools that we can use to promote the industry.
Michael, I'm sure you have some follow-up thoughts on this part of our conversation.
No, I think the infrastructure is obviously very important, and as both Jim and Ed have said, there's the whole question of standards, planning, funding, and all of that will need to be dealt with. There's also, I think, a really important menu of regulatory questions. The ultimate objective that companies like Wisk and Kitty Hawk and others are trying to get to is autonomous flight. And that is a very significant regulatory challenge that the industry needs to address. You know, aviation is founded on this principle of a three-legged stool of a certified pilot, a certified operation, and a certified aircraft. And so, yes, you still have a pilot, but that pilot can be a remote pilot. That pilot can be a system. And how that gets addressed in a regulatory context and how you ensure that that is able to operate safely is a very, very important policy question. And that is foundational to gaining public acceptance, which ultimately this industry is going to depend on. Now, a lot of great work is taking place there. But I think that we all have to acknowledge that while that construct has served us very well, we need to be thinking what needs to be done both in a legal context and what can Congress do to help enable and accelerate that, but also what are the tools that the FAA needs as a regulator to be able to accommodate that. And a lot of really good work is taking place. And I think that that is certainly something that I would like to see as part of the next authorization.
Gary, obviously Wisk is in a unique position given that your vehicle is going straight to autonomy. Just building off of what Michael said, what is Wisk thinking about in how you are approaching autonomy? Is it, as Michael described, there's been I would say a lot of obstacles, especially in the cargo industry, just to get to a single piloted aircraft. So how are you going to get past that? Are you thinking about that now? And who are you working with on this? What kind of assurances are you thinking that the public needs? I think that this is such an interesting part of our conversation. And Michael brought up so many great points. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Great question. So first I'll talk about, why we're going straight to autonomy, and then follow up on what Michael just said about, what kind of policy making and push that we need, I believe, from the FAA and the general federal government. So everybody that's in this space most people will talk about starting with the pilot in the cockpit and then getting the pilot out of the cockpit, getting them on the ground, and the ultimate goal is to do autonomy. And by autonomy, it's an overused word. You could call it, remote piloted or self-flying. You could use different terms. There's a pilot in the loop. They just don't happen to be in the cockpit. But the reason to do so, one, it's safer. And so the more workload that you reduce, the safer aviation becomes. And that's the primary driver for us. Everybody knows over 80% of aviation accidents are some type of human error. Doesn't mean that people aren't skilled, but systems are incredibly complex. And so the more and more workload that we can reduce makes it a safer journey. So that will relate obviously to social acceptance. If we can, beat that drum, if you will, about how safe this is and safer than other modes of transportation. Secondly, the operating costs are lower. And so, and if you add in electric, less moving parts, self-flying, you've got lower operating costs than traditional aircraft. And so then what does that do? That leads to the third thing, where you can actually get to scale and get to afford or have an affordable service for the masses. So think of it as a college graduate, somebody that's just entered the workforce, that they can take this mode of transportation as a daily mode of transportation. Doesn't have to be a special thing or just a premium customer that can get there. So those are the reasons we're going, straight to autonomy. We realize there are going to be other people that will fly first that have a pilot in the cockpit. That's okay. We're designing our aircraft to be fully autonomous and to be able to, hit those guidelines that we've established that I just mentioned. From a policymaking perspective and a regulatory perspective, I do worry about us because I see what is happening in other countries. And, the US is the aviation leader, but I don't know if we will be in autonomy. I really don't, because there are other countries that are being aggressive about it and going after it. Yes, you have to do that in a safe way. Yes, you have to be rigorous in that. but I'd really like to see the FAA mandate an autonomy roadmap and set it as a priority and get industry working on it. As Michael said, it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of stakeholders. It's going to take a lot of work. But set that top-down message that this is an important thing to do. The U.S. is going to differentiate itself from other countries. We're going to be the leader. We're going to continue to be the aviation leader. And then in turn, we can get to work on that as a national mandate, if you will. So I really do worry about our competitiveness if we don't do that in short order, because other countries are.
Thank you. That's great comments. I'm going to actually turn to Jim with a follow-up question, just given how, your long career at the FAA and really understanding the safety culture at the FAA, and maybe even a commitment to the three-legged stool that Michael described. How do you think the FAA is going to, or do you think that they are actually making a change to the way that they look at risk so that they can, I would say, be a little bit more flexible with new aviation technology? I think you and Michael and I remember going through drones many years ago, the very beginning of drones, and how difficult it was to really for people to kind of change their attitude around risk. And the drone community really was knocking on the door of the FAA and really, really putting a lot of pressure on the FAA to change quickly. So how do you think things are going to change now? And how is HAI, and then Ed, how is MBA going to be working with the FAA to help them feel more comfortable with more risk in the system?
All right, well, that was a whole lot there, but I'll start with, the 107 rule. I know, I was deeply involved with the 107 rule. And so it was the first time, I think, and maybe I'm pretty sure it was the first time we were writing a rule that allowed operations versus restricting something. And so
for the audience, would you mind just telling everybody what the 107 rule is?
Sure. So the 107 rule was the drone rule, essentially, that Jenny mentioned. It's what allowed all operations of 55 pounds and under, small drones, essentially. And then it got into the whole certification of the pilot to be able to operate that in certain operations. Doing our best to keep away from the waivers. But the new vehicles, and Gary could probably attest to, I think a lot of the tech companies went out and they looked at the rules and tried to figure out, can they fit in the rules? And that, when I was inside the FAA, I saw that as a little bit of a caution, because while it might have been a quicker way to work, and we're still trying to work into that, the ability for the FAA to come up with another 107 rule that would cover all these vehicles that are being that are out there right now trying to get certified would be difficult. So I guess I'm saying both things, talking both ends here, that we probably should have started 7 years ago with trying to imagine what these future vehicles can do, especially the electrical vehicles. Were very interesting, in my FAA days when we tried to work certain things and thought about how hard it would be to certify a aircraft that actually carried gasoline that could explode. And now we're talking about batteries that are much safer, but we're having such a difficult time getting them through the system. So I think there's nothing at this point where we're at with the FAA. I think, as Michael said, and Ed, it's trying to get some guidance, overarching guidance through the reauthorization bill to maybe focus that direction with some major objectives out there. I think on HAI's part of this is if focus on just one of the mission sets. I mean, helicopters right now, rotorcraft are a vehicle, and then the helicopter, we use them as tools essentially for many missions, from slinging Christmas trees to power lines. And so as these vehicles come online, I know my industry will figure out how to use that capability to fit in with their business, and I'm trying to help them there. One of them is a 135, as was mentioned, the rotorcraft capability. I really don't want the FAA to go too far, because as I just experienced, I was on vacation in Italy, but I was able to visit a member that was able to actually fly from his location, a heliport, but land at a non-designated heliport to pick me up, to bring me back and show me some of the stuff. So these future aircraft, I want to make sure that we don't overdo it as to where they can land and be restrictive of the great capabilities that I think will come with these aircraft as well. So it's a lot of stuff. And that's why I think, both Ed and I need to really be engaged, because we have so many lessons learned and still some of the fights we're trying to do, because our both of our organizations are not very stovepiped. We have such a great variance of operators when you talk about a 135 operator, from a single ship operator to big operators that are out there. So lots of work to be done, but I think Ed and I are up for the challenge.
Well, I think as we look at the FAA and what we need is, we need a culture that is performance-based, and that's really where things have excelled. And Michael, you were a leader in that in your tenure at the FAA. And it starts with looking, what's the problem we're trying to solve for? And it may not necessarily be we're trying to solve for a problem of autonomous flight. We're trying to solve for a problem of safe flight. And what does that mean? And what are the tools that helps us get there? The FAA has a history of bringing forward technologies that advance safety. And you can look as far back as the autopilot, and you can look as recently as auto land. The Garmin technology that has just won the Collier Trophy. It's the first time in history where an airplane can recognize an incapacitated pilot and land itself. So we have found ways through the years to work towards certification, looking through what is the problem we're trying to solve. And with strong leadership, we can find good ways to get there. And I mentioned Michael was at the FAA. I know, Jim, you have a good friend who was head of AVS, and at one point we were looking at enhanced vision systems, and the regulation said something about being able to see, and someone said that means see with the naked eye. It's not looking through technology. And at that point, the head of AVS said, well, if you're wearing glasses, do you have technology? And that changed what is ability to see. And I think that's what we need to keep coming back to. Not what does it say, not what the history is. What's the problem we're trying to solve for? And are we prepared to address that? And I think, there's a lot of reason to be very hopeful that we can write rules and regulations and requirements that are performance-based that allow us to promote safety. And I'm excited about the opportunity to work forward on that.
So I'd like to jump in there for a second. So that with the safety end of it, when we talked about heliports and vertiports, the phase one of being able to operate these vehicles should be able to go to airports and heliports. I mean, I flew small helicopters. I still fly Robinson helicopters. And I was telling my staff here, it's kind of funny that, I can fly and I can land anywhere on the airport that, I'm talking to tower or not. But if I wanted to designate a heliport at that airport, it becomes very, very onerous. And the same thing with I flew Chinooks, so I would come in with my Chinook knowing how much damage I may cause with a rotor blast, but I as a pilot determined whether I can safely land there. So I think one of the easy steps forward is for the FAA to recognize that, the pilot can make a decision by the performance planning that he knows and go to current heliports as a start. Because not just because it's a heliport doesn't mean that all, I can't go in there with my big aircraft if I know that the heliport was built for a smaller aircraft. And I'm going to do that performance check as a pilot. So we can take some of that responsibility off the FAA. I think let's use the current infrastructure to the maximum capability that helicopters can do today.
Yeah, Jenny, can I add to that for a second?
Yeah, please.
I totally agree with Jim. I mean, one of the things you see in this industry, people have nice CGI videos. They have these brand new vertiports. They just look fantastic. It's just a brand new infrastructure that's created, but we have the infrastructure now, general aviation airports, international airports, as Jim mentioned, helipads. And, our view of this is actually to be able to leverage that infrastructure. For us being electric, you have to add electric charging infrastructure, but leverage what we've already got. Instead of having to build brand new things that are special purpose for eVTOL. So totally agree, Jim, with what you just said.
If I could add a point as well, I think obviously these questions are very important, and we want to ensure safety. And I appreciate your comments, Ed, about focusing on performance-based and not getting caught up in this is the way we've done it for the last 50, 60, 70 years. There's also an issue, though, that I think that we just have to keep an eye on, and that is, in addition to aviation safety, the whole question of security. This is a different type of flight that than our society is used to seeing. And we saw this with the drone community when we started the rulemaking for operations over people and night operations. The national security community started expressing a lot of concern. Not only does this technology enable wonderful things to happen, whether it's greater safety for site surveys or package delivery and all of that, but it's the job of the national security community to think about what will bad people do with this technology. And I think that it's fair to say that we at the FAA, but also the drone community, hadn't really thought through how, in the early days, how to bring the security community along and what their concerns would be and how to address those concerns so that that does not become a blocker to widespread adoption of where we're trying to get. And so I just put that out there. I think that there is much better engagement, certainly between the FAA and its national security counterparts as they start to think about those issues. But I think that we, as an industry, need to be attuned to what might be the security challenges that we need to overcome, and what are the ways that we can deploy technology, operational practices, and a whole host of other things that will address what are very valid concerns about that the national security community might have as this technology matures.
I think that's a really good point, Michael. And I know we've been reaching out to the TSA to talk with them about some of the unique attributes of AAM, but whether it's the security community, whether it's the neighborhoods, there are a lot of people who, if misinformed or misunderstand, it's pretty quick to get to a rush to judgment that has to be back. The reality is, if we have a community of aviation and technology people who are here to solve problems and do it in the interest of the public and society, we can work on things like safety, security, sustainability, and have those built in so that the questions can be answered up front, or the problem can be identified, defined, and then solved.
Yeah, and that's, I'd like to chime in on that too also. And the earlier that we can come to a difficult policy decision, which means that a decision that not everyone likes, but Gary and his company may be able to reach that bar. But instead, I think taking time to waffle and, the security not sure what they're going to do, and nobody wants to make that tough call, knowing that everybody might have to up the bar a little bit. But I think that's important for this advancing technology and the security side. I know, I've challenged my staff, when I first took over a year and a half ago, to get a new heliport inside the SFRA, here at the DC area. We're hopeful, but that's part of, moving forward. So we have to accomplish that. And we need to know whether there's standards to do it so we can actually reach those standards.
Gary, how is WISC thinking about, I know that you're very focused on safety, but also the security piece of this?
Yeah, so we think about it from the following perspective. So lessons learned from the defense industry. And so, we've got drones flying every day. We've got millions of hours of safe drone flight, not non-hackable drones, big drones, things like Global Hawks that are, fairly large aircraft. So, our view is that we're engaging with those type of industry players to learn those kind of lessons and figure out how we can deploy some of those technologies to provide a secure environment, so you don't have bad actors being able to get in these vehicles and do things. And so, we're trying to leverage the lessons learned from the defense industry in terms of the rigor that we've got to establish for a secure network for our vehicles.
It would be remiss if I didn't mention that the FAA did announce an AAM Integration Executive Council. So, Michael, what if you were, still the FAA administrator, what would you charge this executive council with? I think, security certainly would be one of the pieces of this. But, you know, just looking at the vast landscape of issues that need to be dealt with, where would you start?
Well, you know, I talked about the regulatory questions and needing to, you know, I think everyone agrees that we need a roadmap for that. I'd focus on, you know, a couple of areas that I think are going to need to be sorted out, that perhaps haven't had as much attention as we have seen up until now. You know, people are very focused on certifying aircraft, developing infrastructure like we talked about before. The air traffic management questions are quite significant. And I think that there is general agreement that if we're going to have the full potential realized for AAM, we need a scalable air traffic system that, at least for this segment of aviation, is going to look different than it looks for what some might call traditional aviation. Higher levels of automation. But I think the important thing is it has to integrate with what we have today. And that raises a whole series of operational questions. And there is a lot of wonderful work that is taking place, NASA and the FAA, a lot of great research that's taking place that's got to be translated to actual operating practices. There is a related question, which is roles of government. And we have, I mean, it was heresy the first time I said this to a reporter when I was at the FAA, but this whole question of what authorities does a city or a state have? They, you know, the FAA in its charter it is clearly stated that they have exclusive authority of everything that flies. And a city has exclusive authority for things like land use. And so arguably on its face, that's a little bit of a gray area. And the FAA and the whole federal government have really been looking at this question through the IPP and trying to develop, you know, some practices and some policy agreements on how this might work. But I'm still sensing a lot of uncertainty on the part of mayors and city councils and governors as to feeling they need to be in this whole discussion. And it strikes me that we're having a conversation from people that are all saying they need to be at the table. We need to have a conversation which is less about who's at the table is important, but we need to actually talk about what. We can get a group of people together, but what exactly are the things that we want to resolve and the authorities that we want to clarify as we look forward? And then I've talked about the security piece. I think one of the great things about this new group that's being pulled together by the FAA is bringing together the other agency partners that have equities in this. And I think that the involvement of the White House is very important in this, because this whole industry is bigger than aviation. It's bigger than transportation. We've all talked about how it is fundamentally going to transform society. And there are questions that we need to think about as a country of how do we foster the innovation that will make this possible, different ways of thinking about mobility and associated questions of equity, of access, that benefit the society as a whole. So it's a big agenda.
It really is. Gary, I know that WISC has been thinking about the role of city governments and, versus the FAA's responsibility. What are you looking for, whether it's from this council at the FAA or when you're talking to city, state, and other local leaders, what is the feedback that they're giving you and their concerns about the integration of advanced air mobility?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a pretty big mix. I'll start with the very optimistic. So when we engage with mayors and cities, they get very excited about this concept and what it could do. And oh my gosh, it takes an hour and a half to get from point A to point B. When's it available? Next year? Oh, it's going to take a few years before it gets certified. And so it's this, big excitement depending on the city. And so we've seen different things. We've seen cities that are very concerned about, getting this to the masses, so that it's not just a premium service. Can you get to, as I mentioned, the college crowd? Can you ultimately get to, underprivileged communities that, it's affordable enough for anybody to be able to use it? Think of it like rail service, that anybody can use this. The entire ecosystem of who we have to work with, and we're in New Zealand as an example, as a country, to learn lessons from that so we can apply it to the US. But it takes national engagement, it takes state engagement, it takes local city engagement. It takes engagement with potential customers. It takes engagement with people that think this is crazy and they don't want something flying over their head. And so there's the whole social license part of it. There's the engagement with the cities. But by and large, what we found with the cities is excitement and impatience. In other words, they would like to see this happen faster. And when you lay out what it takes to actually get a new aircraft certified, and this is a years-long process, not next year type thing, then they're a little bit disappointed, to be honest. People are pretty excited about the opportunity to offer this new form of transportation. But it takes, as the term goes, it takes a village. It takes all of these communities coming together to work together to pull this off.
Jim, this is also, as Gary mentioned, and others have mentioned, that this is really a global competitiveness issue for the United States. And we have always been the leader in aviation, as others have acknowledged in this conversation today. But we're seeing other countries that are much more permissive in their ability for autonomous aircraft to fly. How is HAI, and Ed, I know you all are thinking about this too, but really, how are you looking at this issue and, talking to the FAA about this, and not just the FAA, but Capitol Hill, local and state leaders? I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, as a international organization, now that the pandemic is getting a little bit more under control, and traveling is starting, I look forward to going to places just like as Gary mentioned, that are actually flying and being there firsthand, and then take that firsthand information back here to the United States as well. Because we know, as Gary mentioned as well, is when I, years ago, when I talked to some of the people that, where they were doing their first operations, and at the time I was in the FAA trying to facilitate that, working with Michael's guidance of how do you get to yes. And they found out they were doing their first operations other than the US, because while they knew they all had to be successful in the United States because of the size of the market, they wanted to do the proof of concept somewhere else. So I think HAI is, I plan to go out and see some of these operations where my members are outside the United States, because I know it's happening.
Yeah, and I'll follow up, but I want to go back a little bit where you were, Jenny, which is the value of having the executive council at the FAA and bringing what seems like our aviation administration together, but that is a lot of people, and it's a lot of different natural silos. At NBA, we're fortunate we have an individual who formerly ran what is now the ATO. We have a woman who ran what is airports. And just seeing how they view things differently lets you know that we do need to find a way to make sure the full FAA is on the same page, so that we are working in concert at what is the aviation part of it. And then has been brought out by Michael and others. There's the security group, in our case, maybe the Department of Energy as well, lessons to be learned, brought in the public. So it's important to get our close-knit family in line as we build out. And then as we look internationally, I think all of us recognize that there are opportunities not just to share our experiences with others, but to learn from them as well. So at NBAA, we do conventions on 3 different continents. When we have been in Asia, we've worked with companies like EHang. When we are in Europe, we featured companies like Viola. And of course, in the United States, for years, we have highlighted AAM companies at NBAA base, the world's largest business aviation event. The goal is always to share examples, to highlight successes, and to learn from each other. All of it building awareness, coming through the aviation community out to government regulators and members of the public, as well as the media. And so I think this gives us an opportunity to keep building out on that. If Gary's company is successful in New Zealand, as we know they will be. That gives us an opportunity to trumpet the New Zealand experience all over the world. So I think it gives us a chance to learn from each other. And I recognize that in the United States, we believe in mobility and we believe in competition, and ultimately seeing examples of mobility and competition will spur action in the United States.
Fantastic. My next question, in addition to the state and local topic being a hot button issue, the other big issue in aviation is always, how is it going to be paid for? And I'm sure at HAI and NBAA and Michael and both you and Gary, I'm sure you've been thinking about this as well, but how should AAM developmental and operational costs to the FAA be funded? And I'll let anybody jump in to answer that, or to tell us what your, any proposals that you have.
Let me jump in just on some of the work that Ed is doing with NBAA. So we've got some massive infrastructure bills that are coming down the pipe. And if we start with infrastructure for AAM and making sure that is part of the bills that are going forward, that's a fantastic way to start to get the landing sites that we need, if you will, that is part of this system. So I would encourage what Ed's been doing and other groups to push that along to make sure that these are part of these infrastructure bills, because they're massive, multiple $trillion bills, and certainly AAM should be part of that.
I would just remind everyone that aviation is founded on a model where the industry supports the investments that we're making. And today we do it through airline ticket taxes, fuel taxes, overflight fees, registry fees. And these new and emerging technologies do not contribute to that. And that is something that the airline industry, that many in aviation are asking a valid question. What needs to be the contribution of these new entrants in order to support the investments that need to be made for the industry? And so I think it is important that we all acknowledge that while we have a funding framework and structure that has served us very, very well for a very long time, as the industry changes, we need, and as these new entrants come into the picture, we need to be thinking about how do we rebalance that, and what are the funding mechanisms that might make sense to ensure not only that we are enabling the innovation in this technology, but that we're creating a sustainable environment financially for it over the long term.
And just building on Michael's comments, certainly in the US, we've had a general policy that recognizes that it's in everybody's interest to have a strong, healthy aviation system to facilitate mobility. And so there has always been a general fund contribution component to it, combined with user taxes that are paid in ways that make sense for the user themselves. So airlines pay through a ticket tax, general aviation pays primarily through fuel taxes, and there are systems that make sense for the given segment. And I think as we move forward, there are some that are going to apply, there are some that are going to evolve, and I think it's a matter of working through what the best ways to make the contribution are that are significant, that are consistent with the operating experience of the entity and the public policy we're trying to address.
Ed, let me just ask you, your organization has advocated for AAM development grants. Is that right? In future infrastructure legislation, I assume it's not in this bill, but in future bills. Can you talk a little bit about this? And then Jim, I'll have you jump in.
Well, the development grants basically are consistent with what I talked about earlier, which is that ability to plan and construct, to recognize that the operations are being discussed as early as 2024. That's not a long time away when you start at 2021. And so as we promote ideas that recognize planning and construction need to take place there's kind of a sense that this is not the kind of conversation that can wait till the next reauthorization bill. We need to be about this today. And so we're very active working with members of Congress today to make sure they understand what this concept is and the urgency related to it. On Capitol Hill, you can only go as far as the bigger tides can allow you to go. But it's important it starts with awareness of what the need is as we then look for vehicles to promote the legislation.
And then we're just working arm in arm with Ed. So I don't think there's anything we're working not together on.
Great. Gary, with the current infrastructure bill, there's, there are priorities in the bill around, making building back better. And how do you see AAM helping our country build back better? And even though this infrastructure bill really didn't tackle the question of sustainability, but with electric aircraft, that certainly addresses sustainability and really gets to the goal of a cleaner airspace system. So if you could talk a little bit about that, I think that would be very interesting for the audience.
Yeah, well, a couple items there. So first on all electric, then obviously, you see the trend of all the auto manufacturers, GM announcing by 2035, everything is going to be electric. I mean, we as an industry have to electrify to provide a more sustainable future for the planet, for our kids, for their kids, and on and on. Just, absolutely critical to do that. But I think there's another aspect of this that's, if you really, and this is future thing, but if you go down several decades and you think of the roadways, and even if we improve the roadways now, they're just not going to be enough roadways for the number of people that might be in cars. And so if this takes off, and which everybody is betting on that it will, then it's a different way of getting around. Then you can envision things like perhaps needing less parking garages. You have more ride sharing. You have more ride sharing aircraft types of services. Less roads potentially that you actually need, less asphalt, if you will, so that city centers become a different kind of world where you might have more parks and more other types of things than just concrete, where cars sit there all day long. And so if we can tie this together, and I'm tying in the multimodal aspects of, think of companies like Cruise and Neuro and other people that are doing either autonomous delivery or autonomous passenger kinds of services. If we can tie these things together, then the infrastructure is going to be different. And it may not be new bridges and new roads and all that, which we have to do because the infrastructure is crumbling, but it's just not going to sustain long-term. It's already overcrowded. And so, if we pull this off and we're successful here, you can envision a completely different world where we have improved the communities, we have improved, people's lives. And so I think it's not just on the electric side, it's really the future vision of where this industry could take us.
Any others would like to follow up on this?
Well, I think this is a place where certainly technology and aviation are very similar, because if you look at our airport infrastructure, they're very much like nodes on a system. They allow multiple connections in every direction. The more nodes there are, the more valuable the overall system becomes. And so as we're looking at building the infrastructure of the future, aviation, airports, advanced mobility aircraft, all of this gives us an opportunity to better connect places rather than divide, to restrict capacity to the size of a roadway or railway. We can open that up by using the 3 dimensions. And so I think the opportunity is clear and in front of us, the opportunity to build back better, recognizing the benefits of a system where an airport, a helipad, a vertiport can open up anywhere is really an exciting opportunity for us.
Still, just to on a proof of concept side, maximizing again the current low-level infrastructure and what helicopters can expand and procedures that will work for these future vehicles. Hopefully, maybe everybody on here saw that, Ted Cruz was able to land his helicopter at a non-airport. The airport was closed, so he landed somewhere and gave some rides. I mean, the ability of these future aircraft, I just hope we don't keep them constrained to, you know, the 135 world of perfect airport environment when they have so much more additional capability. I think Gary mentioned it, to go to third world countries, to go to do things, you know, in other parts of the world where they need the transportation and the movement, you know, that Ed talks about.
Michael, any comments on the connectivity part of this? That you had mentioned equity and access earlier. I know that these are all things that you have always thought about, especially when you were leading the FAA. So we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, like everyone has said, this is such an enabling technology, and you know, we don't want this to be for the rich and famous. That's why, as Gary talked about, you know, there is a laser focus on the part of the companies to reduce the cost per mile. And as you know, with new generations coming into the society, there is a great deal of concern about sustainability. How do we improve the planet? Electric aircraft that can provide low-cost access to communities all through society, you know, that's entirely consistent with what President Biden has talked about in terms of building back better. Yes, we have to restore our infrastructure, but we can reimagine it at the same time and really provide access, sustainable access in ways that we've never thought about before. And that's the great promise of AAM.
Absolutely. Well, I see that we are at the top of the hour, and to be respectful of everybody's time, I just would love to give our panelists minute each, or as much time as you need for a closing remark, and then I will turn this back over to Dan to close us out. Jim, I'll start with you since you are our host.
All right, well, thanks. I really do appreciate everyone's time and the people that have joined today. You know, HAI, I think by Mike Hertzendorf and Chris Martino started an industry advisory council. And we're trying to make sure that we have all the hurdles that people see out there, because it's a common problem for everyone. And those are the ones that associations like mine and Ed want to solve, because we know it's a common ground. And we're using education for our industry to make sure they understand what we covered today. Building the infrastructure, we covered on August 12th. We're leading with vision as we're doing today. And then our AAM Future Global Perspective we're doing next week. So we're trying to educate our members to come along with where Gary and other companies like him are leading, and great thoughts on where we need to be for society 50 years from now. So thank you.
Ed, I'll turn to you next.
Well, I think over the course of the last hour, we've all shared a lot about the moments in time that we have here and the opportunity that's in front of us. And it is going to require a lot of coordination, communication, collaboration. But this is an epic opportunity, and together, if we can realize that, the legacy for all of mankind will be well served.
Great.
Gary, and then I'll have Michael close us out.
Yeah, first, thank you to all the panelists. This was awesome. Very, very good panel. But I would just say, what a great time to be alive, and what a great time to be involved in this. I mean, for anybody that's listening to this, if you're not involved in this industry or this space, get involved. I mean, this is fabulous work. We are, on a mission to fundamentally transform transportation, to improve people's lives, to allow people to get to places quicker, whether it's with their family or vacations or work items. But we're on the precipice here of just something fundamentally transformational in aviation. And, this is like Wright brothers in the early days. This is incredibly exciting. And, I know all the panelists are excited that we're involved at this stage, but if you're not involved, get involved. We're hiring, lots of other people are hiring. I mean, this is an exciting space. It's a great place to be.
Well, just following up on Gary's shameless plug for additional applicants. No, and I couldn't stress that more. I mean, this is an exciting place to be, and I'd just like to remind everyone that aviation has always been about innovation. But you've all heard me say before, but it's also about something else. It's about collaboration. And I think that the way the industry has come together, the way the industry needs to redouble those efforts to bring in new players and really work together to solve problems is absolutely critical, but it is well worth it because, as Ed said, we are at a very significant moment in history right now. And we have such an opportunity to take advantage of that and just fundamentally transform our world. And I couldn't be more excited.
Well, thank you all so much. This was such a delightful and interesting discussion. And thank you to HAI for inviting me to moderate this incredible panel. And Dan, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I'd like to add my 2 cents to paraphrase everybody. In just over 100 years, we've gone from the Wright brothers to flying a helicopter on a different planet. And so the technology that's moving through our timeline right now, yes, it is an incredible time to be alive and in aviation. So please let me extend my deepest appreciation to each of you, to Jenny, to Michael, to Ed, to Gary, to Jim, of course, for taking your time with joining us today. Your experience, your knowledge, your viewpoints were absolutely fantastic and deeply appreciated. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I
do need.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Gary. And well done.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right.
I do need to do a few housekeeping things real quick. For next week, we are actually going to offer a very similar webinar, except with an international flavor. We have representatives from the rotorcraft associations of Europe, Japan, and New Zealand, and we will have Mr. Eduardo Dominguez Puerta, the Chief Commercial Officer at Vertical Aero, joining us for the international version of this same topic next week. And so if you enjoyed this one, please come back to us next week. It will be back at our traditional 4 p.m. Eastern time. That's UTC -4. You can watch for the links in our e-blasts, in our social media, and in Rotor Daily, of course. On September 9th, we have a presentation from the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team. I believe that they're putting it on enhancing safety in our industry. Once again, we can never be too safe. Their safety came up in the topics again and again and again today. And so it's something that we always need to pay attention to and make sure that we are flying and operating as safely as we possibly can. We do have a follow-up questionnaire coming to you shortly. We would appreciate it if you were able to take just a few minutes and share your knowledge or share your thoughts with us about how this went today. What went well, what didn't go well, and please suggest future topics. We do pay attention to those and do try to get those into our schedule when we can. Also, if there's something you'd like HAI to work on, if there's something that you think we're already doing well or we could do better, let us know that too. The easiest way is the email president@rotor.org. Those go directly to Jim Viola. He does see each one and he does task our staff with those as well. That does bring us to a close. Until next week, we ask that you be safe, you fly safe, and we'll see you next week.
Hey, thanks, Dan.